This is Winchester Academy.
My name is Maggie Jones, and I am on the Board of Trustees of Winchester Academy. I'd like to welcome all of you here tonight, and especially if there are some of you here for the first time. You're here for the Bachfest, the fourth event for the Bachfest. We especially welcome you, and we invite you to come back again for another one of the Winchester Academy events. Now I have some announcements to make.
Stand away from the speaker. That's not it. It's not from this system.
Turn off.
You're off.
She's on.
Okay. Nolan, we need help.
You need a foil
The only thing I can think is a man told me I needed to wear his Bluetooth. He gave me his Bluetooth.
I would take that off.
But he told me that's the only way he can hear. Do you think it's
Is that from you?
No, it was,
Put it down and I'll see if I see it.
I mean, it's fine with me.
Realize I should.
I don't know who he,
Who owns the Bluetooth? I don't think it's working with our system. I think it's causing interference.
Someone comes, you can only pay your jacket.
Try it again. I've turned off all of my stuff.
we're really looking forward to this.
We did test this beforehand.
So I have a few announcements I would like to make. Number one, if you would like to be on the Winchester Academy mailing list, there are some forms on the table over against the wall. You can fill those forms out, and then you will receive a mailing at the beginning or just before each of the series, the fall series, the winter spring series, or the summer series. Also, if you would include your email address on there, you'll get an email the week before each of the programs reminding you what's coming up on the Winchester Academy programs. I need to ask you, please, to turn off your cell phones or any other devices that you have. I don't think we want any ringtones combining with our violin tones tonight.
Turn off, what's his name that's speaking?
I would like to thank Georgia Calvo and Rose Doro for serving our coffee and cookies this evening, and to Elvira Peterson, seated over here, who donated the cookies. Thank you. Now let me tell you about another Winchester Academy program, which will be next Monday, October 12th. It will be Dr. Elena Volkova, who is here from Russia. Some of you may know her. She was here in Waupaca in 1993, and she's back to visit, and will be presenting a program called Art on Trial, Religion and Freedom for Artistic Expression. And just before that, on Monday the 12th, there's also an exhibit, library exhibit reception. So it would be in the exhibit room here just off the children's area here in the library. And their exhibit is called Artists of 54981. So that would be Waupaca artists. The reception is from 4:30 until 6:30. So please feel free on Monday the 12th to stop over and look at the exhibit in the library, and then come on over here to our Winchester Academy event, which would begin at 6:30. And I would like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program, Jean and Joan Wasserberg of Waupaca. And now let me introduce you to Dr. Samantha George, who is an associate professor of music at Lawrence University in Appleton. She was a recipient of the 2012 Excellence in Teaching Young Teacher Award. So we know we have a really good person here, don't we? And she's going to talk to us a little bit about violins. What makes a violin more valuable, one more valuable than another? What makes the sound more beautiful on one than another? And she's going to play these various violins for us, and she's going to explain to us what the differences are. But especially, we're looking forward to the prized Guarneri violin that Lawrence Conservatory has, and it's from 1685, so this violin is over 300 years old. So we're looking forward to it, and we thank you so much, Dr. George.
Thank you, Maggie. I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Am I coming out? Am I coming out? If you cannot hear me, can you raise your hand? I'm just kidding. If you can't hear me, you won't know to raise your hand. Okay, we still have a few people who cannot hear me, so if we can bump me up one notch, that would be fantastic. Our one challenge tonight will be that I cannot wear a microphone and play the violin at the same time. This is for two reasons. One, the sound would be very irritating for you because the microphone's extremely close to where I'd be playing. The other thing is I don't think you'll be able to hear the fine nuances and differences in the four instruments I'm going to play when they're coming through some kind of mic system. So we're going to have a little bit of a challenge going back and forth, but we're going to do it great. You know, Maggie just mentioned this prized Guarneri that's on up here on the table, and I want to warn you, it's actually not the oldest violin with me tonight. And I have violins ranging in age from just before that, we're talking about 1670s, up to 2 years ago. So we're going to have a great time exploring some of these instruments. People often ask me, why are violins so expensive? Well, and not every violin is so expensive. There are a number of, especially contemporary makers, who are making very reasonably priced instruments, and I can often help my students find a violin for under $5,000 that can be perfectly adequate. I know, we still think that's a lot of money, right? But then you think about, let's say I'm a flute player, and I want to buy the best flute in the world. Oh. I can get the best flute in the world for about $25,000. Oh. And then I say, I am a violinist, and I want to buy the best violin in the world. And we're talking about $10 million. So there's quite a range in prices for violins, and we are very fortunate that young people now have access to instruments that are affordable, that sound good. I want to make a distinction right away between an instrument that's expensive and an instrument that's good, because there is a big difference. We can talk about why instruments are expensive, having to do with their rarity, having to do with the name of the maker, having to do with when they were made, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're the best instrument. And I want to talk a little bit about what makes a violin great. And I'm going to say category number one is evenness. This might not be something that jumps out to you right away. And what do I mean by evenness? On the violin, I have 4 strings, a low G, all the way up to a high E, and they're tuned in perfect fifths. So I have 4 strings. Often with a violin, especially a violin that's not so great, you start playing the instrument and you notice, wow, the G string sounds amazing. Oh, the D string's like, okay. And then A, I can't even hear myself. And then E, it pops out again. So that's a very uneven instrument. So I'd like to demonstrate, I'm just going to play a scale. This is actually my own violin. I'll tell you more about it. I'm just going to play a scale, which is just a series of notes. Many of you know your scales from your old piano lessons. How many people in this room took piano lessons when they were little? See? I knew it. So you remember all your churning and your scales. I'm going to play a simple scale in first position so we can hear each of the 4 strings of the violin. This is G string, D, Someone said very even, and I agree, and that's one of the reasons I loved this instrument, because you find that as you cross the strings, you have the same kind of sound. This particular violin has kind of a bright sound, has a big sound, but kind of a bright and cheery. I'd like to contrast that. I'm going to immediately play the same scale on the Lawrence Guarneri that we've been talking about, and we'll get into more detail about that too. I would dare say that this Guarneri is also very even, but I want you to start listening for the timbre. Maybe even think about some words you would describe to describe its color in comparison to my violin. So also pretty even, right? We didn't hear a point where I would change the string and all of a sudden the sound would be very different. But the overall sound was extremely different than the first violin we heard. I would describe it as darker, kind of a mellower, maybe more mysterious quality than the first one that we heard, which was my violin. These violins, by the way, these two that we just heard from, were made about 15 years apart. My violin in the 1670s and then our 1685 guy over here, the Guarneri. And pretty close to each other too. Both of these makers studied with Amati, who's one of the most famous violin makers of all time, really the first person to put together what we call the modern violin. And for those of you that do crossword puzzles, you see Amati a lot, right? So you know all about Amati in your old crossword puzzles. But my violin is actually made by someone named Bartholomew Pasta. Yes, pasta like the food. And I remember when I was trying it, my best friend at the time said, you have to get it because the name. Because your whole life, you're going to get to tell people that you play on a pasta. And Pasta was actually living in Venice, which is a little bit unusual because many of the violins from this kind of golden age of violin making were made in Cremona. So Venice, he was striking out on his own up there. You can see these instruments, both gorgeous to look at. My violin on the left here, the Pasta, is actually a little bit smaller than a full-size violin. Maybe you can even see that with naked eye, although you can come up at the end and take a look at these instruments and compare. It's a little bit smaller. For me, that's fantastic. I'm not a super small person with super small hands, but just having the extra reach for me is great because the string length is a little bit shorter. I do have students with the tiniest hands you've ever seen, and you just don't even know how they play the violin. But this was a nice match for me. This kind of brings us to our next question about what makes a violin great and what makes a violin valuable and how these are different. Condition is very important. These instruments are old. They've been through a lot. So actually, that's a good sign. We know they're durable. They're held together only with glue. There's no nails in here. There's nothing else. We have glue. And that's the most common repair we have on our instruments is seams opening up in the wintertime and having them re-glued, which is a very inexpensive repair, sometimes even $10 to have your violin repaired and a seam fixed. But when you think about it, that's pretty amazing. These are still intact. Condition can make a huge difference in the price of an old violin, and one of the reasons I could afford the one that I own. Mine has a fundamental flaw called a sound post crack, and that doesn't mean the sound post inside is cracked. It has to do with the main body of the instrument. And a sound post crack, of course it's repaired because I'm playing on it and I love it, and it's paid for. A sound post crack actually diminishes the value of a violin by 40%.
Wow.
Which is huge. And when I was thinking about buying it, my violin guy was looking it over for me. And you always do that when you're buying a violin. You don't want to just say, oh yeah, this person told me I'm buying this Stradivarius and I think it's great, so I'm just going to buy it. You never want to do this. You always want to take it to an expert and have them look it over and say, what's the quality of this violin? Is this violin what they say it is? In fact, my violin had been sold as a completely different maker about 10 years before I bought it. So this can happen. You want to know, what is this violin? And what is its value? And what is its resale value? And what do you think about the condition? Did it have a repaired sound post crack? Well, my violin guy took a look at the violin and he said, you're in big trouble. You're in big trouble. You have the repaired sound post, but that's not it. There are about 20 other cracks that have been repaired through the years. And what this means for you is that you can play it fine right now, but you're going to have a lot of problems when you sell it. So I thought about this for a while, and then I realized, but I'm in love with this violin, and I'm never going to sell it, so I don't care. And so I bought it anyway. So now the Guarneri does not have a sound post crack, so that's already going to put it in a very high range. It also is in beautiful, beautiful condition. Everyone I've taken it to has said, wow, I mean, it's amazing that it has stayed this long. So these are our old guys up here on stage. Something you should know about these old guys, they originally looked like this. This is a Baroque violin. And when Guarneri and Pasta would have been making their violins, you're talking about late 17th century, right? They weren't making modern violins, they were making Baroque violins. On the surface, you can see a lot of things are the same, okay? Overall shape is very much the same. Things you'll start to notice, though, the fingerboard. That's the area where we put our fingers, which is made of ebony. Shorter on the Baroque violin over here, okay? The body itself is a little bit thicker and sturdier than the modern violin, as well as, let me see if I can kind of hold this in a way you can see, the neck is much thicker and at a slightly different angle. So it's a little bit of just a different thing. The bridge shape is also, it's probably hard to see from where you are. You can come up and look later, but the bridge shape is also very different. Another big difference, you know, on this violin I have a chin rest for comfort. I can rest my chin there and play for long hours. And this one does not have a chin rest. They both have shoulder rests, and that's just because those are mine and I put them on so that I could be comfortable with my giraffe neck when I'm playing the violin. The Baroque violin would not have been held the same way a modern violin. The modern violin I hold quite upright. And this is something I'll just tell you, violin students work really hard on this positioning because we know that if the violin is up parallel to the ground, we're going to have the most projection that we can have. So this is something we work very hard on. But Baroque violinists wouldn't have held the violin like that at all. They may have held it like this, kind of draping down with the arm hanging against the body, and some even held it near the stomach like this and protruded out like this. Well, this was fine because they weren't shifting all the time. Now we are shifting, we're moving our hand around all the time in modern violin playing, and we're vibrating. Okay, so this is a lot of stuff going on. They would have played primarily in one position. If you listen to a lot of Baroque music, you hear it's a smaller range than if you're listening to Paganini concerto. So the whole playing position would have been different. The other primary difference is the tuning. So I'm going to play what an A is. We tune to the note A. That's one of our central strings. See if you can just hold this note in your ear for a second. We can sing it. La, 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 la. We're keeping it alive. We're keeping it alive. And here's my Baroque A. Okay. Ooh, I know. It's a full half step lower. It's a full half step lower. This is tuned now to A equals 415 revolutions instead of 440, which is our modern A. By the way, if you go to Europe and let's say you have a good ear and you kind of you're keeping these A's and A flats in your ear at all times, some people are, you go to Europe and you're going to be like, whoa, they are playing even higher. Because a lot of European orchestras even tune to 446 and 448, and we in US tune to maybe 440, 441. This is 415, and it's lower, which is going to bring a much darker color. These are also gut strings, which is what would have happened in the Baroque period, sheep gut. And unfortunately, I guess this is a realistic experience. When I opened the case today, when I got here, yes, you notice, I'm missing my E string. That's the top string, and a lot of pressure on that thin string, and it breaks the most, both on the modern violin, but especially on the Baroque violin where I'm dealing with gut strings instead of steel strings. Okay, so very different material. These are going to break much more often. And unfortunately for me, it requires a very intricate tying of special knots to reattach a string. I have done the tutorial online, but I didn't bring any gut with me today, so I couldn't fix it. So I have 3 strings, but I can give you a little bit of idea what it sounds like. Very different. That string, I don't know. Okay, so that was part of a partita by Bach. Since I know you're your Bach Fest, I figured I'd play some Bach. Our D minor partita, and that's the Allemande or German dance movement. I'm going to play one more time just so you can just kind of hear that. You can tell already, though, it's much quieter than the modern violin. It's not built to project in the same way. And kind of like a fuzzy sound. Fuzzy sound. I'm using the Baroque bow. I'm using the Baroque bow with it. Which is shaped in a very different way than the modern bow. I'm just going to walk around a little bit. The Baroque bow expands outward, okay, and the modern bow goes inward. So you can get an idea. It's shorter. It looks like I took the tip of my bow and put it through the pencil sharpener, and it came out like this. So this is the modern bow in my left hand and the Baroque bow in my right hand. Very different shape and very different sound. The modern bow has about 180 hairs on it, and the Baroque bow has about 90, so about half as much hair going on. So I'm going to play, oh, we have more violins. Oh, fine, we have little violins now. Okay, I'm going to play one more time on the Baroque violin with the Baroque bow, a little bit of the Bach, and then we'll try it on a modern violin just to get some contrast. Pasta. Guarneri. So I think what you're probably seeing right away is it's not just a difference in the sound of these instruments. There's a difference in the personality of these instruments. Kind of the ironic thing about what we're discussing is this Baroque violin that I was showing for you with the tuning down and the different shape was actually made 2 years ago. And we actually don't have that many original Baroque violins because once violinists became more and more interested in having power and playing in bigger spaces and playing flashier repertoire that would require shifting and moving the hands around, they had their Baroque violins modernized. So when we're talking about the pasta violin and the Guarneri violin, these would have been Baroque violins, and they would have had different accoutrements, and they would have, the necks in particular would have been extremely different, much thicker, and without the kind of slope that we have now, much flatter neck, flatter bridge, obviously no chin rest or anything like that. So these instruments became what they are today, modernized, so they're really not completely original. This is good because the Baroque violin, as you can imagine from hearing it just for a couple seconds, does not project in a big room. There's just no way. And I even left my microphone on when I was playing it. It's a very intimate sound. And it can be a very beautiful sound, a sound that can draw you in. And I know I am a huge Baroque performance practice fanatic, and I work a lot with the Baroque ensemble at Lawrence, and we play on the Baroque violins and with the Baroque bows, and it's like entering another world, and you have to open your ears to listen in a different way. It's a quieter way. It's a more muted way. You're not going to get blown over with the power of the sound. By the way, I just want to try a little thing today, if we could, having to do with playing the violin. I think we see people play the violin. How many people in this room play the violin, first of all? Okay, good. You're going to be like all-stars at this then. See, look, they know exactly what we're going to be doing. I just think it's kind of good to get in touch with what it's like to play the violin, because it's kind of unusual what we do with our bodies. You think it looks so natural, and when you see a good player, it looks like it's effortless, it looks easy, like they're just drawing the bow and they're moving. So first, if you can find a way, you might have to rearrange yourself in your chair to extend your left arm. So far, so good, right? This feels great. This is like our stretch for the day. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now we're going to actually bend that. We're going to turn that into this type of angle. Okay. Now, I see a lot of people are kind of like waving at me while they do this. You're going to have a problem playing the notes right now if your hand is facing that way. So I ask you to please twist your arm and bring your pinky toward you basically as far as you can. Okay, farther, yeah, I know. You might have to use the other hand to adjust. That's okay. Let's see, what do we got going on? Okay, another little problem with playing the violin. If you have your fingers like this, you're also going to have a hard time reaching the strings. So try to bend. Okay, now remember, if you're practicing the violin for 3 hours a day, you look great, by the way. If you're practicing the violin, you're like a natural. You want to come take some lessons? Yeah. Okay. When you're practicing the violin, you're going to have to pick it up and put it down like a lot. So we're just going to do that a few more times. Just, you got to keep picking up your violin. Now we're doing this. See, some people are already like, ooh, that's not so comfortable. Remember, violin only weighs a pound or two, so you're okay. You're going to be all right. You get some exercise, right? Okay, good. Let's come back up. Great. Now we're all set. Let's start playing some notes.
Yeah.
We got notes. Okay, left hand. Left hand is going to do the fingers here, because remember your right hand's going to do the bow. I know people ask me all the time. Well, then don't violinists do this depending on what hand they are? But not really. It doesn't really matter because we're asymmetrical. Our hands are doing different things. Okay, now we're going to start shifting, because remember, we're not in the Baroque period anymore. We're not playing all in one position. So sometimes I'm playing up high, and sometimes I'm playing down low. My fingers are going, good. Looking good. Technique. I love this. Okay, but we need to vibrate. Can we get some vibrate? That's right. Hey, don't stop. You stop playing notes. You started vibrating, and you stopped playing the notes. Get notes, vibrato, shifting. Okay. We have some like Paganinis in here, but they haven't used their bow yet. Okay, let's get the bow going. Let's get the bow going really slow while the left hand's playing really fast.
What about the cramps?
Okay, now let's get the left hand to move really slow and the bow to move really fast. You see what's going on. This is not normal human behavior. And in particular, I noticed the biggest challenge is this twisting motion. It can be very damaging for the students, and we're very fortunate we have a number of programs in Alexander technique and also in workout courses like yoga and Pilates that can help instrumentalists, because violinists in particular develop their muscles very asymmetrically, and in particular have a difficult time straightening out the left side of their body because they've spent so much time hugging the instrument. We're going to take a break in a few minutes because I understand there's a raffle, but There's one other member of our team here that you have not met yet, and I wanted to introduce you so we can be thinking about this as we get into more detail. I also brought along, this is the very first violin I ever bought. It's not the first violin I ever played, because the first violin I ever played was like this big, like this one you have over there. It was like that. And I borrowed violins from family members who had been violinists. Or when I was in college, my teacher was a big collector of violins, and he had about 18 violins and about 80 bows. And he would get us set up with that. In particular, if we were playing a kind of a substandard instrument, he would loan us an instrument. And so I wound up in a situation where I had a master's degree but didn't own a violin. And I was very fortunate at the time. My parents were living in Idaho, and there's a big violin making school in Salt Lake City, Utah, okay, called Peter Paul Prier's Violin School. And one of his students, Terry Borman, who made this violin, had studied with Peter Paul Prier and then gone to France because he thought, I need to get a different perspective, like what are they doing over there with varnish, like I want to know what's happening. And so he came back from France and was set up in Salt Lake City making violins. So this violin was made in 1992, and I think I will never sell it because there's some kind of pride in the first violin that you buy, and also I love having it around because if my students have violins that explode, which happens more often than you think, I have an instrument I can put in their hands immediately, and I also use it when I do a lot of Baroque music and I want to tune down to that A415. When I want to tune down for long periods of time, I have an instrument I can do that. So I'm going to play, just to give you an idea of a different sound, I'm just going to play that same scale that we started off with, just to kind of, you can hear about evenness. This is going to be a little different. And I'm going to play a little bit of that back, and then I'm going to play on the Guarneri again, okay, just so we can start training our ears about how this works. So this is a quite good modern instrument, not as expensive as the old violins up here. Okay. Yeah. It's like not bad. Here's the Guarneri, same thing. So let's just recap, keep the sound in our ear. Encouraging, and now you see what I mean, is that you can get a modern instrument or a contemporary instrument that's going to be affordable for a student, and it's going to sound okay, right? It might not sound like the Pasta or like the Guarneri, but certainly for a college student, going to be perfectly acceptable for their music studies. So we're very fortunate. I know we want to do a raffle, so we're going to do that, and then we'll talk more about the violin. Okay.
All right, we're going to just quickly do the grand prize drawing for those who don't know what this is about. This event is the fourth event in our Bach Festival. We're from the Wapaka Community Arts Board.
Can't hear you.
We'll get you. Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good, then I don't have to yell. All right, we're from the Wapaka Community Arts Board. I'm Marcy Reynolds. This is Anita Olson. And this event tonight is the fourth event. Winchester Academy was very gracious to offer to do an event that would be part of our Bach Festival, so we so appreciate Winchester. And we had 3 other events. Thursday night last week, we had a community concert at Trinity with some really great local musicians. Friday night, we had Bach in the Brewery, and that was up at the Central Waters Beer Brewery.
Sounds good.
That's awesome. And it was Stas Venglevsky. He's from Mondovia, and he's a champion violin player. The guy is a virtuoso. And then Sunday we had our concert. It was a chamber group led by Dr. Pat Miles, featuring Nell Buckman on piano, and that was at St. Mary's. How many people went to that? That was a religious experience in more ways than one. And tonight we have the wonderful Dr. Samantha George. So we feel like anyone who's gone to 4 events should get college credit somehow. Oh my God. Can you? Because I want it. All right. So, every 2 years we immerse ourselves in the music of Bach, and it's becoming a really big thing in Wapaka. I think the next time we do it, in 2017, it's going to be even greater, but I can't imagine it being better than this year because we had a little bit of everything. We want to thank the Community Foundation. They funded our Bach Festival. We had the owners of T-Dubs that funded the Friday night event. We had a lot of collaboration from Trinity, St. Mary's, Central Waters, the library here. Central Wisconsin Symphony Orchestra was very supportive. And one of the things that we did to get people involved, if you weren't a Baroque musician yourself, was we created a passport, which I'll show you, these passports. And you can take one when you leave just if you want a souvenir of tonight's event. But we made it so that if people went to all 4 events, they would be eligible for a fabulous prize. And that's what Anita's holding here. So there's all kinds of wonderful German things in here because remember it's a Bach Festival. So what I'd like to do now is draw the winner. We actually had quite a few people that went to all 4 events. And I think it was really, really fun. I'm going to miss seeing all of you who were there all 4 times. We kind of got to know each other. So what I'd like to do is have Samantha draw the winner. Anita, if you can deal these out like cards. It's like Go Fish.
I already know which one I want.
All right, and who is the winner? Written on the back or inside? Let's see. Jeanette Handrich. Yay! Awesome. And I guess that the only other thing I'd like to do is all the people who went 4 times, could you just stand up? Because I think you deserve recognition for your dedication. It's really great. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're back. We talked a little bit now. I think you're getting some ideas about what makes a violin great as opposed to what makes a violin valuable. But I want to go through just a few more because it is an interesting distinction for us to make. I think I mentioned briefly power and projection becomes a big issue for us in the contemporary performance spaces. My job before being a professor at Lawrence was I was associate concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra. And when I won that position in 1999, I was playing on a delightful French violin by a maker named Violin. If any of you are familiar with the violin soloist Hilary Hahn, she plays on a violin. She plays on a JB violin, and I had a relative of that violin, NF violin. And I loved this violin. I tell you, this violin, it felt like it was made for me. It was one of those things you pick it up and you think, this is it. It just fit my body. I loved the sound I could get on it. I felt so good every day playing this violin. It was just like magic for me. But although the tone of this violin was exceptionally beautiful and exceptionally warm, when I was sitting concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, I did not have enough power to project when I was playing a violin solo. So this was slightly heartbreaking to me because I loved this violin, and for every other type of playing I was doing when I was just playing in the section of with everyone else in the orchestra, when I was playing chamber music, I loved this violin. When I was teaching, when I was practicing, I loved this violin, but the conductor comes to you and says, it's not enough tone. And that's when I started shopping for the pasta. That turned out to be just a very fortunate sequence of events where a dealer in Chicago said, oh, you're looking for a violin, try this. It happened to be the first thing I tried. The first day I got it. I also fell in love, and it was the only time in my life I practiced 12 hours in one day. By the way, that's not a healthy thing to do. Like, if you feel like you want to tell your children or grandchildren to practice 12 hours a day, don't. It's really not good for your body. But I was, again, in love, and that's another quality that comes up with these instruments. You fall in love with them. Your first impression, just like the first time you meet somebody, and you know, I'm going to like this one or not. So with the violin, I sold it to one of my best students at the time, who's now finishing her doctorate at the Eastman School of Music in a double degree of violin performance and psychology, PhD in psychology. And so I feel if it has to go to one of my students, I'm glad it was her. But I have told her repeatedly, if she ever decides to sell it, I would buy it back in a heartbeat, because it's a violin I miss playing every day. So there is this element of power. You need to have an instrument, especially if you're sitting concertmaster of an orchestra or you're playing the concerto solo with an orchestra. You need to have an instrument that will project. Same thing if you're the first violinist in a string quartet. Your sound needs to be able to soar and be supported. So this becomes a real issue for us. That's not necessarily the most expensive instrument, isn't necessarily the one that projects the best, but that's something all violinists are looking for, especially if they're power violinists, which I was trying to be. Another quality, and these don't always go hand in hand, you think they might, tone. Beauty of tone. So you might find an instrument that's very powerful, that's like steel, just cutting through an orchestra and projecting to the back of the hall. But if the sound isn't beautiful, if it's not attractive, nobody wants to hear it. It reminds me of this this way I have my students practice a lot. One of the things I can just tell you about teaching college violinists is that, and high school violinists too, most of their energy up to this point has been spent developing their left hand. That's just because this is what's playing the notes. So they're thinking this is very important. And they're having to learn a lot of music for their youth orchestra or for their solo and ensemble and little competitions they're doing. They're having to learn a lot of music, and so they need to know a lot of notes. So they're working on the left hand. So I very often get students, or have students apply to my school, who have very advanced left hand technique and very weak sounds. Weak sounds and weak bow arms. This has not been developed in the same way. It's not been prioritized the same way. Plus, I can just tell you, teaching the bow arm is about 100 times harder than teaching the left hand. And so a lot of times teachers just feel like, I'm leaving that for the next guy, and I'll take care of getting you to play all the notes. So I often have my students practice this exercise. I'm not going to turn off the microphone because it won't make any difference. I call that the lawnmower bow. And your goal with the lawnmower bow is that as you go through the bow, you do not let the actual note of the string sound. This is very difficult for the students because they don't have power. Okay? So very often I'll show that to them and they say, oh yeah, that's like super easy. I can do that right now. I'm like, okay, let's do it. And I get something like this. No. If I hear the note of the violin, you gotta go back and do it again. And getting this idea of contact with the string. The reason this is very important for us is because because if I'm at that edge, if I'm at that brink where I'm about to sound lawnmower, but I don't, that's the loudest I can play. And that's a very important dynamic to know. So if I start off lawnmower and I release it a little bit, I could easily go right back in. That's going to be my forte, my loud sound. And so we all need to know what that is. And to be able to find out, is that loud sound, is the loudest sound you can make a beautiful sound? So this is all related to having enough power, both here in the violin, but also finding a violin with the beauty of tone. I think I've already alluded to it a couple times, but comfort is very important when a player is choosing an instrument. I think this comes up even more with violas. I don't know if you know this, but violas, which are slightly larger than violins, there's no standardized size for a viola. So it depends on the player and what they like. And when you hear violas talking, it's really nerdy, because they'll be like, I'm 16 and a half. And the other one's like, I'm 17 3/4. And it becomes this whole competition about whose violist is the biggest and whose is the most comfortable and all this stuff. So this is violas for you. With the violins, we have a more standardized size. I did mention mine slightly smaller. It's not quite a 7/8 size, but it's a little bit smaller. So this for me is very comfortable. But it's more than that. You can feel it when you pick up an instrument. It often has to do with traveling around the instrument. Some instruments have thicker rib areas and bouts. You can probably see really well if I just hold up these two. The one on the left, to my left, it's going to be harder for me to move my arm around that instrument than the one on the right, where it's much narrower at the top of the instrument. So this is a comfort. Comfort also has to do with the way the neck feels, the thickness of the neck, and where your thumb is going to be positioned. So an instrument that might be very comfortable for me, this is a very comfortable instrument for me. Someone who's taller than I am or has longer limbs than I do may say, whoa, it's like you're playing this little toothpick or something. I can't even feel the violin, and need something that has a more substantial neck. So this comes up. There's also a comfort in the way you play. We all have different playing styles. We all have different bow arm techniques. Some of it's our physique. Some of it's the kind of sound we're attracted to. Some of it's the way we've been trained. We're going to play with different techniques. And if you notice that your technique is not coming out on an instrument, in other words, the instrument's not responding to your technique, it's not the right comfort for you. I think the most telling example of this is two of our greatest violin makers of all time, Stradivarius, right? We know about the Stradivarius violins, and our Guarneri's violins. And I'm not talking about Andrea Guarneri like what we have here. I'm talking about Del Gesù, which is considered the top of the line Guarneri violin. And when you talk to professional violinists who have played on both of these types of instruments, almost all are going to have very clear and definite opinions about which maker they prefer. And it'd be actually really interesting to do a study by gender, by size, of the person, by the way they've been trained, whether it was European training and American training, types of bow arms, types of setups. It'd be very interesting to actually do this scientifically, but I can tell you for sure, having played both of those in the same day, Guarneri, for me, was so much more comfortable. In general, they're slightly smaller violins than the Stradivari violins, and for me, the sound was more malleable. I found I could do more with the sound. The Stradivarius, I think, had more power, and it was more direct sound. I'd almost describe it as more masculine sound. It was going to penetrate to the back of the hall, but I didn't feel I had as much control over the depth and the warmth of the sound. And you talk to other people and they say, oh, hands down, I would never want to play Guarneri if there's a Strad around. So it's a very interesting issue, this comfort. Those are obviously all very expensive, valuable violins. I think I've also mentioned love as an aspect of choosing an instrument. This is very important. If you're not in love with playing it, you're not going to practice. And if you don't practice, you know what happens? You don't get any concerts. And if you don't have any concerts, you don't make any money. So this is very important that you love the instrument and you want to spend time with it. And I've seen it literally transform a student's life when they get an instrument, sometimes even a bow, where they feel like this is so me, I want to play on this, and suddenly the level of interest in the playing and the commitment to what they're doing, it just goes through the roof. So these are all very important things. But what about value? We can imagine, I mean, we're just getting a small sampling here, we can imagine there would be cases where a violin would have all of these qualities and not necessarily be that expensive, right? This might happen. We might find it that even violin has some power, well made, in good shape, beautiful tone, comfortable, you love it. And it might be like that contemporary violin made in 1992 that sounded pretty good. We might also have an instrument that's very expensive that doesn't have all of those qualities. So it's a catch-22. Then we start talking about, well, then why are these old violins so valuable? Okay, well, first of all, there aren't very many of them. So already we're dealing with a very rare species. If we think Stradivarius made, what, 600? More? 1,200?
Only 600 in
But
existence.
about 600 are still around. That's already a very rare item. So a lot of people are going to want to collect a rare item, which, by the way, is a shame to collect an instrument of that caliber and not play on it. It can be detrimental to the instrument. It won't stay alive. This wood needs to be vibrating. It needs to be alive. And I know with the Guarneri, which I babysit, which stays with me, I often will, if a student has an important recital, an important competition, I make sure it's being played, because the worst thing for it is for it to sit in my office and have people like look at its case and be like, oh cool, that's a Guarneri. No, we need to be playing these instruments. So we have the rarity issue. There's been a lot of debate about varnish. You've probably heard about this along the way. Was the secret in the varnish? Do we think this varnish is somehow special? And modern makers have gotten really great at pretty much reproducing the varnish in these instruments. And you can see even with these oldies, the two oldies, very different kind of complexion, coloring, technique. The back are a little more similar. It could be that the vine doesn't have its original top too. That's a possibility. So you can see, even instruments of the same era we're dealing with, and where the maker studied with the same person, we can see the varnish going in a different way. We can see with the contemporary a very different approach to the varnish, a much redder kind of look. Something that's always fun about violins, by the way, I think all of these are two-piece back. Yeah, some violins are one piece of wood on the back, and some are two on the back. And it's easy to spot because the twos kind of have like a scar that goes all the way down, and the grain might not exactly line up. And the one-piece backs are very beautiful, just one piece of wood on the back. So very different varnish. We don't really know if that's a secret ingredient that makes those violins superior in some way. Another theory is the wood itself, the location of the wood, the age of the wood. And if you know any violin makers, they're very into researching their wood and tapping on wood and working with the sound of the wood before they even make an instrument, looking into what is this wood, what's the resonance in this wood. And as they work with the instruments, and I'm not an expert on this because I've never made a violin and I don't think I ever will because it's way beyond me, but they're constantly tapping around, listening to the different frequencies of the instrument. And if you need a repair of some sort, if they're trying to find some place that might be injured or where the glue might be falling apart or where things are weak, you're going to see that knocking because they can hear immediately when the sound changes. So that's working with the actual wood sound, not just the sound of the violin. So we don't know. I mean, I think the main issue is that with rare art objects, they're desired because they're antique and they're interesting and they have stories. And we like to think about who played these instruments and where they've been. And did Vivaldi play a concerto on my violin? I mean, like, maybe he did. How cool would that be? I play Vivaldi all the time, so it'd be awesome to know that he played the pasta. So, I think there's a certain fantasy to these instruments too. I think it'd be interesting, and there have been experiments with this, of playing all these instruments not knowing which one was which, and seeing which your ear would be drawn to. I introduced them as what they were at the time, but I think that's also kind of a fun game. I wanted to quickly mention about the bows, because I mentioned about the Baroque bow, which is really fun to play, because it's very light and bouncy. Brazil. Except the Baroque bow, which is made of a snake wood. And if you come up and look at it later, you'll see the slight marking. It looks like a snake skin on the bow. These can also be mounted in many different ways. This is my everyday bow, and I love it, and I've had it for over 20 years, and it's mounted silver, and it was really inexpensive, but you talk about comfort. We've been talking about comfort. A bow where I feel like every time I pick it up, I know what it's going to do. It's not going to throw me loops. Then I have one that's going to throw me lots of loops. It's the more expensive of the bows. And it's a gold mounted, if you come up, you can see it's very beautiful. It has some inlay into the frog, a gold tip, and really a very sophisticated tone, but unpredictable for me. I don't enjoy playing it as much. But what I think is fun, now we have a lot of bows. You can see this is purple. And I do have a red and a black, and along the blue, and along the way. Now bows are being made of a lot of different materials, carbon fiber materials. What other kind of materials? Carbon fiber. Woven carbon fiber. And I remember being really surprised. I bought this kind of on a lark because it was $40. And I thought, I didn't even know you could get a bow for $40 and it's purple, so that's going to be fun. And it'll just be like something I kind of goof around with, or if we're playing a Pops concert in the symphony, I'll just have my purple bow because, you know, it's flashy. And I was so surprised because I was teaching a lesson later that afternoon, and there's a bow stroke. Have people heard the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto? Do you know this piece? It's like one of my favorites, right? Okay, so of course, I'm a violin teacher. What did you expect me to say? There's a bow stroke in the middle of the cadenza, which is, it's difficult to learn. I'm not gonna, you know, lie to you about it. It's tricky. Your bow kind of has to bounce a little bit, right? So you're going back and forth like across the 4 strings, but the bow's got to bounce. So you're right. It's like, you know, this stuff has to happen in your wrist and your fingers. And when I teach it, they have to start like, we start like that, you know. You know, and you have to kind of work up to it. Anyway, I was teaching this lesson, and the student was playing the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto, and we were working on that passage, and I thought, I'm just going to try the purple bow and see what it does. And it did it! And I thought, you know, for a $40 bow, that's pretty cool. So I went back and bought more. I gave my dad, who was a violinist, I gave him one. And I love this because if a student has a bow explode, which also happens more than you'd imagine, I can loan them the purple bow. They can bang people over the head with it. They can do what they can, like throw it around. It'll never break, and it sounds pretty good. And they won't lose it because of the color. So it's been a win-win. I also brought today just for you to look at my baby bow, and this is a 16th size bow. And I can just tell you the reason I do this is purely for pedagogical reasons, which is a number of my students don't want to play in the lower part of the bow. They don't want to play at the frog because it's hard. It's harder to play at the frog than the upper half. You're like out here, it's like feels good to have control at the frog. So I give them this bow, which is all frog, and they can't go out here, and they have to practice. So I just brought it for kind of fun. But it looks like we just have a couple minutes for questions about the violins and the bows. And I'm gonna have a little sip of water here.
No. Yeah.
I'm going to repeat the question. The question was what kinds of wood are used to make the violin, and the answer is several, and it's a combination of hardwoods and softwoods. Pegs are made of pegs are tuners, rosewood and boxwood. Maple is ribs, spruce, pine, and the back is also maple. So you can see a combination of hard and soft woods. Very interesting. Yeah, they're very beautiful. Yes?
What did you say?
Okay.
What did you say? The strings, the bow string. What are they made of?
Sure. Okay, so the bow hair is what we call it. It is actually horse hair from the horse's tail, bleached, right? And but you'll see signs with bass bows where they can have a much more coarse hair will work well with the larger instrument. They don't actually play on the bleached hair, so they just have like, it can be black sometimes. And we have over 100 hairs on each bow. And we also put rosin on them, on the hairs, so that it grabs the string. If you just have the hair and you start going, you just go, there's no tone. So we have the rosin that grips the string. And I love rosin. Like everyone makes fun of me because I rosin all the time, because I feel like you're only into it if you have like clouds of rosin above your head when you're playing. But it's true. There's something about the having a lot of rosin on the bow. You're really able to grab the string.
I agree. I played cello many years ago.
And do you like rosin?
Yeah, and I had one bow that was, I think, horsehair, but another one that I think had nylon.
There's some synthetic hairs.
They're not
right.
nice.
Right, yeah.
They're
You stick with the real hair. And we're so fortunate here in Wisconsin. We have one of the best bow repair people I've ever met in my life. And he just lives in Fond du Lac. So this is great. He does all my students' bows and my bows. And he can do like colored hair. So if you want like green and gold hair on your bow, you can get that. And he has any combination he does like red, white, and blue for July, and so it's really fun. But if you rosin a lot, the color is going to go away. So, and we talked about the stick itself is Pernambuco wood from Brazil. Yeah. You have another question? Here's one.
How significant is the bow string quality relative to the physical, like the wood part of the bow, to the sound?
Okay, so he's asking about the quality of the stick versus the quality of the hair in terms of your sound. The stick is what you buy, okay? And bows are going to range. I mean, I told you about my $40 bow. That's probably about the cheapest bow you can get. Up to $30,000, I'd say, for a bow. Whereas your rehair, if you don't like it, you can get a new one for $60. So the trick is to find somebody who can rehair your bow who has good hair, access to good hair, which is why my bows actually don't have the dyed colored hair on them, because I didn't find that the quality was what my traditional hair was. So, and if you don't like your rehair, which happens all the time, you go back and you get another one, and $60 later, hopefully you got better hair. So you're really investing in the stick. You're investing in the quality stick. Talking about, it's about balance. It's about the balance, the weight of the stick, what you like. I like a very flexible stick. Some people like a very firm stick. What feels good for you? So again, very personal choices with bows. Yeah, we have a question back.
Does the breed of horses make a difference?
Yeah, it's, no, you know what? I was just talking about this with my dad, who's a real music nerd. And there is, and I can't remember what it is. And he may live here. It's like Arabian something. Yeah.
You mentioned that each violin has its own personality.
Yeah.
So how do you get all these personalities to come together in this beautiful orchestra?
Isn't that the trick, right? Everyone in the orchestra is going to be playing different levels of instruments, with different sounds. This has to do with the way we actually play the instruments, is playing together in an orchestra. And what you think about playing together in an orchestra is the way you use the bow. So your goal in a section of an orchestra is you're always in the same part of the bow as everyone around you. You're always doing the same kind of bow stroke. So am I doing a bouncy stroke? My bow's kind of bouncing. Or am I on the string? Right? Am I going to use whole bows? Am I going to use short, picky bows? This is what you're working on in orchestra rehearsal all the time. Also the bowings. We can't have some people going down and some people going up at the same time. Not only is it dangerous for like eyeballs and things like that, it just, you're gonna look bad and you're not gonna sound good. You're not gonna be unified. So the way the orchestra sounds so good is by unifying the use of the bow, and to a certain extent the use of the vibrato and the fingerings. We don't want to have, you know, a bunch of people in one position and one other person up here doing something gypsy or something. That won't blend. Except for, yeah, Jerry and I do that all the time. But that's how orchestras work. And I actually think the beauty in the sound comes from the diversity of the instruments. I think if everyone were playing on exactly the same instrument, the sound wouldn't be nearly as beautiful and textured. So it's really kind of the joining of all of that, creating the sum of its parts. Yes?
Going back to that
Hi.
question of playing together in the orchestra.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So who's responsible for taking the lead and setting what direction everybody's going? Is it the first chair? Is it the conductor? Is it sectional practices?
Yeah, she's asking about who takes the lead in this organization of the bow. And it's primarily the concertmaster. The concertmaster usually does the bowings, writes in the bowings for the orchestra. They'll give their part to the librarian, and the library staff will then copy it into everyone's part. Now the thing, and I can just tell you, this is the most frustrating thing about the violin. We only have two directions, down and up. Okay, and our down symbol is like this, and our up symbol looks like a V. That's all we have. So I don't know how we get ourselves into so much trouble. Because you ask about any violin, oh, what do you think about this point? What do you think about, everyone has a different answer. Different things feel good for different people. So it's about finding what works well for your section. And I try to cheer my students up with that when they get frustrated when they're playing. I say, look, all we have is down and up and 4 fingers. Like, we're gonna be okay. Just hang in there. But it can be very, the combinations can be very exasperating. The conductor, however, has veto over the bowings. So if the section is playing along, things are going great, everyone thinks so, but the conductor doesn't like the sound that's coming out. The conductor can talk to the concertmaster and say, I want to change that bowing. I want to try something different. I don't like the sound here. So that's kind of how it works, but that's why the concertmaster's leadership position is vital to the sound of the orchestra.
We have one more question.
Yeah?
You made me rethink my idea of the violin. I played it for 6 years, junior high, high school, to get in the orchestra. I was left-handed, and I felt so resentful of having to bow. My natural inclination was to use the left hand for bowing, but maybe I had just as much of an advantage with the left hand and the nose.
Yeah, and I mean, there are people who have trained themselves to go the other direction. It's a little awkward in ensemble settings because they're facing a different way. I mean, but it does happen. I can tell you, I've always had left-handed students in my studio. I think I have 4 right now, and in my opinion, they're just smarter than everybody else. So I don't think it makes any difference, and I think it can help. Actually, I think it's a different perspective. So yeah, so good for you, left hand. It's the way to go.
Well, thank you, and we're going to end on that note. If any of you have other questions, please stay afterwards and you can speak to them. We have 2 exits from the room, so you can go through the back or through the front. Thank you.
And do feel free to come and look if you would like to just look at the instruments.